right, thank you very much for that very warm welcome. It's good to be here. We're just going to jump into it, have a discussion about American foreign policy, America's role in the world, where we are, how that intersects with domestic politics, and I want to maximize as much time as we have to talk, so I'm just going to jump into it. If I'm on my phone here, it's because this is where my notes are. It's not. I promise I'm not on Twitter. So Bismarck once said, it was probably apocryphal because all the good quotes are apocryphal, but he said that America was the most blessed nation in the world. We had a stable, friendly country to the north, a weak, poor country to the south. To the east we have fish, and to the west we have more fish. So why not just, Kori, why not just take advantage of that? Why not embrace what God has given us and sort of build a fortress America? I ran for Congress a few years ago, and it is kind of difficult to go into small towns in like Mansfield, Texas, and talk to truck drivers or plumbers or small business owners and explain to them that we might need to take money out of their pockets and potentially take their sons and daughters away for things that are happening in Kyiv and Taipei. So why not just sort of go behind our borders and hope for the best?
So I'm sympathetic to the fact that it's a difficult case to make for exactly the reason you say, Mike, which is that, the United States won the geopolitical lottery. We have good neighbors and oceans, and so we are going to be the last country affected by the collapse of the international order that the U.S. built with its friends after World War II, right? Like, we have the widest margin of error of anyone, and so it is a hard case to make. Americans aren't natural internationalists because of our good fortune. But I think the way that when I'm talking to my dad's Rotary Club, I get a little bit of traction is to use the insurance metaphor, which is that it is much cheaper and much easier to keep something that's already beneficial in place than to have to recreate it. And what we had to do in World War II was recreate it because we had allowed an international order that had made us safe and prosperous to atrophy. So it's going to be way more of those kids are going to have to be at risk if we allow the international order where we have lots of help from lots of other wealthy and free societies. If we allow them to go under, we will have a lot less help and a lot bigger challenge subsequently.
Terry, similar question. You were an astronaut. You're an astronaut. You've been up to space. How do we justify a space program to the American people? I mean, I'm sure we've all heard this. As we've talked about these issues, why are we spending so much money on space? It's a little bit more complicated now because there's a lot more private sector involvement. But why go to the moon? Why go to Mars? We have problems right here on Earth. Do we get anything, any sort of benefit, or is it just exploration in and of itself?
I was with Mike Griffin years ago. He was the administrator of NASA, and he was despondent. He was like, Terry, they had just done a survey, and the average American thought that NASA got 22% of the federal budget. So the real number today, it's about 0.4%. And when we launched my space shuttle mission, when you get into space, you open up the payload bay doors, and that's where your big payloads are. And I know, and it was about $1 billion. By the way, thank you. Both of my missions were $1 billion each, so thank you all for that. But when we open up the payload doors, there weren't $1 billion bills that went out into space, right? They're all spent right here at NASA headquarters, at Goddard. We have engineering jobs and science jobs in large part because of the money NASA gets. We have private companies now, but in the 60s, like Rockwell and Grumman, and there were private companies that built Saturn. So there's a pretty good, any government money gets spent, there's some economic return on investment, but the money that NASA spends is pretty good. And there is science that we do, but The other thing is you can look at, there's countries that don't have space programs and there's countries that have space programs, and which one would you rather be?
Can I add something to that?
Please.
Which is America's actual superpower is the power of inspiration and space exploration. I mean, you were telling us a little bit ago about the possibilities for generating human kidneys.
Yeah.
For people who suffer from diabetes, that's amazing. And so to be a country that imagines a better future actually is a huge advantage to the United States.
Can I add in real quick? I was in, to talk about America's role as a superpower, I was in Corsica, France years ago, in an F-16. There was an air show. I flew my F-16 down there, and there was this little old French man. I think he was probably there when Napoleon was exiled. And he came, and we were speaking in French, and he came up and he was like, "You're America. You landed on the moon." Like, that's the best branding that you could possibly have.
Just out of curiosity, you said that when we were talking before, that you served with cosmonauts.
Yeah.
What was So Russia's industrial base has become very important over the last 2 years. It's much talked about. What was your impression of the Russian space industry, the Russian space force? Because, I mean, obviously it's a very horrible situation in Ukraine. Obviously things aren't going exactly the way we like.
Yeah.
But it did seem, for a while there at least, that it felt like their military was sort of held together with tape and baling wire. Is it a similar with their space operation? That's got to be terrifying up there.
Yes. So they, again, little old men. There are these old guys at Roscosmos, and I was there almost 10 years ago. And the problem is they're dying, and they are like the one person who built the rate gyro sensor. There's like one guy, and as these people die, they don't have engineers to fill them in. There's no innovation in Russia. It's a Soviet thing. All the young people don't believe in all the Putin stuff. They just want jobs. They want tech jobs. They want to work in finance, and they all left. Like they've had the ultimate brain drain. So the Russian space industry is not the space. Although they can brute force things. They have a huge nuclear. We can't just ignore them. We were talking about nuclear war. You can't ignore them for sure. I don't want to guess that their nuclear weapons are not going to work. You have to assume that they will. But the Russians are not. The Russian trajectory for this century is downward. The Chinese are the ones their trajectory is upwards.
And what we have seen over the course of the 2 years of Russia's most recent invasion of Ukraine is that there is a weaving together of bad guy countries. So China is providing Russia the vehicles which the Russian economy can't make. North Korea is providing the artillery shells that Russia is firing on Ukrainian cities. And Iran is providing the drones that are terrorizing and targeting Ukrainian civilians. So Russia doesn't necessarily have to have the industrial base to fight its war. It's getting it from others.
Can I add on that real quick? And this should terrify all of us and anger all of us. Iran and North Korea are really good allies. You can depend on them. They're providing their friend with what they need. And America is an awful ally. All of Ukraine, for 2 years, they've been like, why aren't you giving us what we need to win? It's not just the Republicans this time. For the last 2 years, we have not given them what they need to win. And our brand has taken a hit because of hesitancy for the last 2 years and now completely cutting them off for the last 2 months. That's not a good place when Iran is a better ally than America.
So that sort of leads into some other things I wanted to talk about. But, I mean, first of all, I want to ask, how did we get here geopolitically? And more specifically, did the United States squander its victory in the Cold War? My 13-year-old daughter just recently started getting into politics, which is great. And we're watching The West Wing together, so we're going episode by episode, and it's great. 40-minute episodes, it takes us like an hour and a half to get through because we pause and talk. It's a great thing. But even, I know it's fiction, I know it's Aaron Sorkin, fantasy politics and all that, but even just 20 years ago, watching that show, there was this feeling that we truly were a hyperpower. Fiction, yes, but it just sort of felt like we were the only game in town, and we could sort of bend much more easily the international situation to our will, and things were easier. I think it's pretty clear that we've lost that. Now, we were always going to lose that. There was no way that with the rise of China, with India, globalization, people getting richer, the diffusion of precision munitions, that gap was going to close. But we did have like a 10-year gap where I think we really could have done a lot of good things, and it feels like we squandered it. Do you agree, and why? Was it Iraq, basically?
So I don't agree, actually, because the U.S. made a number of mistakes after 1991, but we also made a number of really good choices. And I think there is two tendencies that we should curb. The first is a mythological belief that there was a time when American leaders were great statesmen instead of tawdry domestic politicians, and that we only made judicious choices. And I'll just give you an example. The year of our Lord 1954, right? There'd probably never been a better qualified president than Dwight Eisenhower. And yet, in 1954, he and his Secretary of State had to threaten our European allies with an agonizing reappraisal of American commitment if the Europeans wouldn't admit Germany into the European Economic Community, and they didn't. The American military was forcibly integrating schools in the American South. The United States government was clandestinely working to overthrow governments in Iran and in several decolonizing places. I mean, math class isn't newly hard. Math class has always been hard. And we do ourselves a disservice if we think it used to be easy and now it's hard. It's always hard. Moreover, in the 1990s, the United States expanded the NATO alliance, bringing into both the Western economic sphere and the Western security sphere hundreds of millions of people who had yearned for that for 70 years. We created an international financial network where the Federal Reserve actually is the central banker of the world. And that's, as a French prime minister once said, an exorbitant privilege. And so I think I agree with you that the Iraq War was a squandering of American potential. But I think we tend to overstate that. And let me just give one last statistic, which is that we have a tendency to think of the United States as the Chinese government thinks of us, as a country in decline who has squandered its moral superiority. But you know who the people who genuinely believe our values are universal and we are stampeding towards success with them? Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are the two people who believe that, because they won't trust their publics to test the proposition. The last thing I'll say is that in 1990, the United States was about 40% of the GDP of the G7, the 7 richest countries in the world. Now we are 58% of the GDP of the 7 richest countries in the world. So we are getting stronger relative to the strongest countries at a time in which China is now marooned in the middle income trap. $18,000 is the per capita GDP of China, which is roughly the equivalent of the per capita GDP of Mexico. And they can't now make the political choices for ideological reasons that will propel them back to success. So we don't have the problems of a rising China. We have the problems of a stagnating China.
So whenever we think about the costs of the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan, obviously the most important costs are those of American lives and other lives, but also a whole lot of money. But wasn't a huge cost of those conflicts and how those conflicts were waged and conducted that it sort of undermined a fairly broad internationalist consensus within this country in both major political parties. There are always exceptions to this. Obviously, on the right, there was sort of a Pat Buchananist wing. On the left, there was the New Left, the Blame America First crowd. But it really does seem, maybe because of Iraq, for a number of reasons, that one major political party, my former political party, is now, I don't know how else to put it, anti-NATO, which is just unthinkable. And things are bad now, and if the past is any indicator, it's only going to get worse. I don't know, in 2028, can you win a GOP nomination by saying that you're going to honor Article 5? So is it going to take another world war to rebuild a broadly popular internationalist consensus in America? And if not, can this work if only one party supports it? It only takes one anti-NATO president for it to go away without a shot being fired.
It's a great question, and it's scary we actually have to ask it at this moment in time when the United States is so safe and so prosperous. I don't actually think it's true, though, that only one political party supports America being an ally to other free societies. Just to take the example of aid to Ukraine, if a bill can get to the floor of the House of Representatives, it is going to overwhelmingly pass. So the problem, 69% of Republicans, registered Republicans, favor continued or increased aid to Ukraine. So we haven't actually lost this fight, even in the Republican Party, and we need to keep prosecuting it. I would encourage all of you to call your member of Congress and advocate for passing continued aid to Ukraine so that they can continue to fight for their freedom.
So I think what I just heard is we need ranked choice voting to not have Marjorie Taylor Greenes and Matt Gaetzes. But back to like America being a superpower and what's it going to take. The most disappointing thing about Trump is not Trump. It's that tens of millions of Americans think that he has the character and skill to be president. That's what, yeah. He's a serial loser and has been his whole life. But I heard a podcast, and I forgot who it was recently, and it really opened my eyes. There was a guy named Father Coughlin back in the 1930s. He was the Tucker Carlson of the 1930s. He was a fascist. He was actually pro-Hitler and pro-Mussolini, and there was a time there was 120 million Americans, 30 million of them tuned in. A quarter of the country were listening to this guy every week. And until December 6, 1941, Americans didn't want to go help England. Unfortunately, that did take a world war, to your point. And we need leadership to make the case. It's really good for truckers and average Americans who are not, Enterprise Institute or at this conference. It's really good for them that there's a stable world order and that they can have free trade and that their kids don't have to go fight these wars. The other alternative, there's a vacuum will be filled very quickly. Then China and Russia will run that world, and that's a world that we don't want to live in. We just need leaders that can cogently make that case, and that's what's been lacking. For the last few years, the president is not capable of making that case to the public, and certainly Donald Trump's making the opposite case, like we should support the dictators. So we need leadership that will do that.
So speaking of China and Russia, when I was in the military, it was drilled into our heads that he who defends everywhere defends nowhere. So if you got to set up a defensive position or something like that, you've got to make choices about where you think the bad guys are going to come from, what assets do you have, how best to employ them, because if you just sort of spread it all evenly, then you're not really thinking, and it's going to be a much weaker defense. So thinking big picture, strategically, United States, the world order, has all sorts of threats and challenges. China, Russia, Iran / Hezbollah / the Houthis / militias in Iraq, Taiwan. ISIS has not been in the news, thank God, too much recently, but they're not all dead yet. So how do we prioritize and rank these? Because even for a superpower, he who defends everywhere defends nowhere. You have to make choices, and you only have so many resources. So how should we think about balancing those? I will say that I'm a huge supporter of Ukraine. I very much want us to have their back. And I don't have a whole lot of patience for the unthinking criticisms of our support of that country as they fight off this existential threat. Some of the more intelligent critiques have said that this is going to be a sideshow to a much larger century-defining struggle in the Pacific, and that we're wasting money and attention and energy on this. I don't buy into that, but how do we rank all these problems? Yeah. It's a big world.
So China is the only country that has the combination of economic strength, military prowess, and ambition to overturn the American-led order. So China should be the priority. I'm just back from a trip to Tokyo and Taiwan, and what the leaders of both of those countries said is China will be more dangerous and more likely to go after Taiwan if Ukraine doesn't succeed. And so I think, yeah, they deserve our support. So there is a tendency, even in the Pentagon right now, to say we should be so worried about China, we shouldn't do other things. But they're not unconnected, right? And ensuring that Russia loses, that aggression is penalized, and that people fighting for their freedom have the support of free countries is going to be important for making sure Xi Jinping thinks today's not the day to make a lurch towards Taiwan, or for North Korea to doubt whether they could fire any of those 10,000 rockets and artillery shells at Seoul, South Korea, and get away with it. So if you say we don't have to care about other people's problems, then the pool of help you have for solving the problems that are most important to us shrinks. I was on the NSC in the George W. Bush administration, and after September 11th, we went around to countries around the world and said, we want your help. And a whole lot of them wanted to help us, but what they also said was, we wish we had the luxury of the problems you're worrying about, because we actually have bigger problems. And so it's important not to lose the perspective that most countries think what we are worried about are luxuries compared to the problems they are trying to solve.
I totally agree. And the way I look at it is if Ukraine wins, then this is the last battle of World War III. And if Ukraine loses, it's the first battle of World War III. Yeah. I strongly believe that.
So you mentioned sort of going along with this.
Oh, I'm sorry, can I add one other thing?
Of course.
Since you brought up ISIS, actually the tumult we are seeing across the Middle East, not just the war in Gaza, but threats to the Straits of Hormuz, attacks by the Houthi in the Red Sea, in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates. This is what the world looks like when the United States decides it's not worth our small marginal effort to sustain a stable order. And the last 3 American presidents have wanted to walk away from the Middle East. And when we do, the last 3 presidents have been of the mistaken belief that if the United States steps back, other countries will step forward. And the other countries who step forward are the countries we don't want to be successful in those regions. That the countries who are our friends and allies, most of whom are not strong enough to protect themselves without our assistance. If we step back, what those countries do is think that they have no choice but to make compromises in order to get along with regional bullies. And that's not a world we are gonna like.
So, after September 11th, we spent 2 decades fighting wars. And throughout that time, I don't think policymakers, I don't think guys on the front lines, the American public, ever really had a concern that we would run out of bullets, or that we would run out of artillery shells, or that we would run out of precision-guided munitions. I think it's certainly been eye-opening for me over the past 2 years, sort of seeing how quickly the world's number of artillery shells can be depleted. And it's been very, very frightening. You mentioned China's middle income gap. About a year ago, I read a really good book by Hal Brands called The Danger Zone. It's a great book. Probably not going to do his thesis justice here, but he basically says that we're in a danger zone right now in terms of conflict with China. That they have been rising for a while, they're sort of plateauing, and then because of demographic challenges, because they are in this middle income gap, they're not going to be able to keep growing, and they're going to start relatively declining compared to us and compared to the rest of the world. So this is potentially their best shot to get Taiwan or to cause some sort of other mischief. And so, first of all, I don't know if you agree with that or not, but can we support NATO? Can we support non-NATO allies like Ukraine? Can we fight potentially a major war with Ukraine with our current defense industrial base? We're all good, well, maybe not all of us, but we're all good free market conservatives here, and we should sort of get goosebumps whenever somebody says the word industrial policy. But should we have some sort of industrial policy to sort of rebuild a defense industrial base? I don't know how many ships we could build in a year if we had to build a whole bunch of ships really quickly.
So the dirty little secret of military assistance to Ukraine is that what it has revealed is that the assistance we are giving Ukraine is marginal to what we would need. We do not have the ability to fight so we have been fighting militaries that aren't our peer for 30 years. If we had to actually defend Taiwan, the United States military would run out of precision-guided munitions in under a month. So what we are giving Ukraine isn't actually relevant to this bigger problem. What it is revealing, hopefully in time to fix it, that we have a badly under-invested defense industrial base, right? It's not the function of what we are giving Ukraine. What Ukraine is to the present is what Britain was in the late 1930s, a warning to us that we have not invested in a military that we could very well need very soon. And so we should give aid to Ukraine, and we should also, 68% of money spent on military assistance to Ukraine is actually spent in the United States. It's spent rebuilding the industrial base that we will need for ourselves, even before you get to assistance to American allies. So this is a really good investment. All we need to do in order to rebuild the American defense industrial base is spend money and give businesses multi-year contracts. Because what has happened in the last 20 years is Congress and the administration playing chicken. So they don't put munitions into the budget, knowing Congress will have to back and forth and back and forth. So businesses don't trust either the administration or Congress. They need us to commit to 2, 3, 5-year contracts so that they can hire and train the workforce and be able to expand their industrial plant to do the kinds of things that are obviously needed.
Yeah, you can't snap. You can't snap your fingers and just create an artillery factory or something like that, right?
I think what I just heard is we need ranked choice voting. Because Marjorie and Matt Gaetz are not going to vote they're going to shut the government down. They're not going to do the things that we need. And by the way, you just said snap your fingers. I was tweeting on February today, 2 years ago, that we should be the arsenal of democracy. So this isn't like, wow, who thought of this? We've had 2 years to become the arsenal of democracy. And Europe, and by the way, we should be doing all that we can, but it's a European problem, and the Europeans have been really pitiful for the most part. They have not, they're still in the end of history, post-Cold War, peace dividend, and they haven't gotten up to speed.
That's fair.
You don't think so?
I do not think that's fair. Germany is both the quintessential laggard and also the country that has taken in hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees, which is something we are not doing. The U.S. has provided the largest share of military assistance to Ukraine, but Europeans have provided the largest overall share because they are committing to humanitarian aid that we're not. They're committing to all sorts of civil stuff that we're not. Also, Germany has actually added $100 billion to its defense spending and is sending tanks to Ukraine. I mean, I agree that Europeans were more fizzy and hopeful that it was the end of history than we were, but they're also getting their act together faster than we're getting our act together on this.
So I'm going to try to get 2 more questions in real quick. I hope it's clear that I very much support Ukraine. I want to do whatever I can for Ukraine. What grade would you give the Biden administration? All right, because obviously I'm very happy that they've supported them. I wonder how much this dance they've done has hurt the war effort, where they sort of think about tanks and they debate tanks and they finally say, okay, we're going to send tanks, and then the tanks actually start shooting at Russians, 12 months after we started talking about it. And they did this with jets. It seems like they're doing this with ATACMS. Obviously, I think we got HIMARS there fairly quickly, but I mean, I'm afraid that all of these delays and all of this, whatever the reasons were, has led to a stalemate, whereas if they had ATACMS 18 months ago and jets 18 months ago, who knows where the front line would be right now? Who knows who would control Crimea right now? So
you are exactly right. I
All
would
right,
encourage everybody to go to the Washington Post website and look up an interactive piece made by one of my colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute, Brady Afric, because what he does is show with satellite photography the way that the delays over providing assistance to Ukraine permitted the Russians to build the defensive belt that Ukraine is now having to, at great cost in lives, fight their way through. So we are complicit in the failure of the Ukrainian offensive because of the time lag.
I'll say I would give Biden a D, maybe a D minus. He's done the minimum, but yeah.
I'd give the Biden administration a solid B. That they deserve it. They identified early what the Russians were doing. They declassified the intelligence and publicized it, first privately to allies, to give everybody time in their own domestic debate to build a solid Western front. They've provided an enormous amount of assistance to Ukraine. Where I think we might agree is that the Biden administration has been slow and hesitant in the delivery of assistance in ways that assisted the Russian war effort. And also, their overriding fear is of the United States being drawn directly into the war. And that's what's driven the hesitation. And they have conveyed that anxiety so repeatedly, right? How many times has the president said, we don't want World War III? And that has encouraged the Russians to understand where the limits of our support are, which is something you should never do to encourage an adversary.
So on this point, do you think it was mostly the self-deterrence thing, or was it bigger talks that I don't understand about stockpiles and relations with allies?
No.
It was just the escalation thing.
It was and is the escalation thing.
Okay, shifting gears a little. Yep.
So let me just give the contrast. In the 1958 Berlin crisis, when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev threatened that unless the United States recognized East Germany, which would have collapsed West German commitment to the West, that they would shut off West Berlin and we'd have to fight to reopen it. President Eisenhower's response was to say nothing in public and to privately say, if you want a war over Berlin, we'll give it to you and we'll win it. That's the difference about a president who understands how to deter an adversary and one whose choices are encouraging an adversary.
So
Let me just say real quick.
Yeah, of course.
We've been guided by fear, as you just said, fear and timidity, and that's not what you should do. And we have the weapons, and Europe has the weapons that would have helped Ukraine, if not win totally, they would be in a much different situation, and we haven't given it to them. And they know it, the Russians know it, the Chinese know it. So the last 2 years have really taught the world a lesson that I think is a bad lesson that we should not have taught them. That we're fear, we're not going to support our allies the way we can. And the Ukrainians know, they're like, if you would have given us this, my husband would not have died. It took us a year to get them one Patriot battery, a year. It took us 18 months to give them 30 M1 tanks, 30. The Russians have 3,000, you know. So I'm not as kind, but I understand. We have, if it hadn't been Biden, Ukraine would have been taken over. So at least we did that.
So shifting gears a little bit, you come out of Republican world, obviously worked for a Republican president, worked for the late, great Senator John McCain. I got to say, yeah. I think like a lot of people in this room, I've just had such whiplash over the last 10 years. And I gotta say that if you're looking for Reaganism whenever it comes to foreign policy right now, in the year of our Lord, 2024, it's not in that party. It's Abigail Spanberger. I mean, I'm really not sure why this happened exactly. I'm sure there are a million different reasons. There's just negative polarization, all of that. But, I mean, you mentioned, first of all, I'm not quite sure if 65% of Republican voters who actually turn out support Ukraine. And those are the ones who matter in primaries. But also, even with the Senate vote a few days ago, J.D. Vance made a big deal about the fact that everybody who voted for the aid was over the age of 55. I mean, the future of the party seems to be, the younger people in the party seem to be isolationist, Fortress America, let the world burn types. So, I mean, do you agree with that? If you want to be a Reaganite in foreign policy, does that mean you basically have to be a Truman Democrat these days?
Well, we'll take the Truman Democrats along with the Reagan Republicans. You are right that we are having a huge conversation among conservatives about what we want America and the world to be like. But in fact, the people in this room are the answer to that, which is we will be less safe and less prosperous. Our children will pay a much higher price for restoring an international order in which we are safe and prosperous if we lose this argument to the J.D. Vances of the Republican Party. We actually need to win this argument among Republicans in addition to working shoulder to shoulder with Truman Democrats.
Okay, Mike, one more thing.
Yeah.
I think what we were saying is that we need ranked choice voting, because if you elect people who appeal to the base of their party, and the only people who vote in primaries are the extremists, that's who you get, and that's who we have now. So.
Okay, that's all of our time. Thank you very much. I hope you got something out of this. Enjoy the rest of the panels.